before we ride into today's story, go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all across the country. The stagecoach rattled over the worn plank bridge, the sun sinking low behind the dusty ridges of the Arizona plains. Its wheels kicked up the ochre dirt, and the air smelled of parched earth and sweat. A few men lingered on the porch's saloon, tossing cards and spitting tobacco, but even a pause when the coach creaked to a stop. The driver tipped his hat and muttered something to the guard behind him, who nodded and swung the reins. The town's post office door squeaked open, and the marshal's head peeked out, dust clinging to his weathered hat. He squinted at the newcomer and then returned to his ledger, indifferent to the bustle of the day. But this visitor was not just any traveler. Clara Whitmore, 24, stepped down from the stagecoach, her gloved hands gripping the worn edges of a small trunk. She had crossed hundreds of miles, leaving behind the textile mills of Pennsylvania, the clanging looms, the soot-stained air, and her mother's silent mourning. Her chest tightened as the last plank touched the dusty street. Every step into this desert town felt like crossing into another world. She had come for one reason, a man who had promised her a life on the frontier. Letters he had written carefully folded in her trunk told stories of a small homestead, of quiet evenings by firelight, of work worth doing. She knew these words, knew the rhythm of his sentences as if memorized. But a man on paper was not the same as a man in flesh. The thought made her stomach twist. Ethan Cole, 35, stood near the corral, leaning on the fence post with his sun-darkened hand resting over the worn grip of his rifle. He was a ranch hand turned deputy, and every line on his face spoke of years in the saddle and countless nights under a merciless sky. His eyes, sharp and calculating, softened only slightly when he saw Clara step down. He didn't rush forward. He didn't bow or smile in some polite theater of greeting. Instead, he watched her, noting the way she clutched the trunk, the hesitation in her stride, the flicker of nerves in her eyes. Then, with a deliberate step, he crossed the space between them and lifted the trunk with a grunt, his strength steady and deliberate. She glanced up at him and caught the faintest shadow of a smirk, though he quickly erased it. Silence fell. The town watched in the distance, the blacksmith polishing a horseshoe, a few kids perched on the hitching rail, but the air around them was charged with quiet. Clara's heart raced not with expectation, but with the weight of decision. The man who had written letters promising a life of honesty and steadiness now stood before her, flesh and bone, not the comforting character of paper. Ethan set the trunk down outside the small homestead, the boards creaking underfoot. The house was simple. 2 rooms, a small barn, a fence corral, and a weathered roof patched in places with old shingles. Dust drifted in the warm breeze, catching the rays of the sinking sun. It was not the grandeur of stories, but it was solid. It was real. Clara let out a slow breath. "This is it?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Ethan's eyes didn't flicker. "It is," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of certainty. "It's not much, but it'll hold, and it'll be ours if we make it so." She studied him, noticing the hardened edges of his face, the calluses on his hands, the steady weight in his stance. He had written carefully, measured words across hundreds of miles. But here he was, no letters to hide behind, no polite assurances. She felt a tremor of both fear and awe. "You wrote me all that," she said, gesturing toward the folded letters still tucked inside her trunk. "And this is what it looks like." Ethan nodded once. "Words are easy. Living it, that's different. I wanted you to know what you'd be walking into." Her hands tightened on the trunk handle. "And if I can't?" He leaned forward slightly, eyes steady. "Then you do what must be done. We survive. We build, one step at a time." Clara swallowed, the weight of the journey, the risk, and the unknown pressing down. She nodded slowly, as much to herself as to him. "Then let's begin," she whispered. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, the house smelled of pine and smoke, of dry earth and dust. Clara placed her trunk by the door, unpacked a small bundle of letters, and laid her mother's shawl over a chair. These were small claims of home, reminders of where she came from, Yet they changed the place already. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching her. For the first time in years, he realized that the house no longer felt empty. It felt like possibility. The first night fell heavy over the plains, the horizon swallowed in deep purples and muted golds. Clara lay awake in the small bedroom, listening to the groan of the wooden floor under Ethan's boots as he moved about the house, checking doors and shutters. Every creak made her pulse jump, a reminder that this life demanded vigilance, that danger here was never far, even if invisible. By the next morning, the sun spilled across the kitchen table. Ethan had already started the coffee, the tin cup steaming in the cool air. Clara rose slowly, testing her legs against the ache from the long ride. The house seemed smaller in daylight, the room sharper, the dust more visible. But it also carried a warmth she hadn't expected. She could see how a life built from hard work, measured steps, and steady hands could grow into something lasting. Morning, Ethan said, not looking up. His tone was calm, but the weariness in his shoulders betrayed nights of restless thought. He poured her a cup without asking and gestured to the chair. Clara accepted it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I need to know," she began, her voice soft, careful. "About the land, about the house. What do you expect from me?" Ethan leaned back, one boot resting on the rung of the chair. "I don't expect perfection, just that you live here, with your hands in it, your mind with it. Feed the animals, keep the fire, mend the walls. Make it yours if you can. And when I ride, I want you steady, not afraid." Clara studied him, noting the honesty in his gaze. No flourish, no romanticized promises, only the truth of what life would demand. And that truth, as harsh as it was, felt more real than the most carefully folded letters she carried. "Then I'll try," she said quietly. "I've nothing left to go back to, if this is a life. I want to learn it." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "That's all I ask." The days stretched long and dry. Clara swept the floors, stacked firewood, and fetched water from the pump under Ethan's watchful eye. He didn't hover, didn't correct her unnecessarily, but he observed, measured, ready to guide if a mistake threatened safety. With each task, Clara felt the weight of responsibility, the slow but steady growth of belonging. By late afternoon, Ethan hitched the wagon for a supply run into town. Clara followed, curious and cautious, her hands lightly gripping the reins beside him. The town had a rhythm all its own. Women trading eggs, children darting between carts, men shouting prices over the counter. She felt the curious glances, the whispers that carried even in the open air. Ethan's presence beside her was enough to ward off the boldest observers, yet she knew judgment lingered like dust in sunlight. At the general store, two ranch hands muttered near the counter, barely lowering their voices. "Mail order bride," one said, softening the deputy. Clara's fingers clenched the basket she carried, but she held herself still. Ethan glanced at her, jaw set, eyes sharp. He didn't speak, but his gaze cut the room, warning anyone who might overstep. Back on the wagon, the ride home was quiet. Clara stared down at her hands, fingers brushing the basket's edge. "Do you care what people think?" she asked softly. Ethan's voice was even, measured. "I care less now than I did before, but I care about you. That's enough." The days settled into rhythm. Clara learned the pulse of the house, the pump handle's resistance, the chicken's daily patterns, the way the fire needed feeding at twilight. She understood the land's quiet language, the subtle shifts in wind that warned of storms, the distant creak of a gate signaling a wandering horse. And Ethan, once a man divided between duty and home, began lingering longer at the house, returning before sundown more often, sometimes just to sit beside her while she worked, silent but present. It was during one such evening, with the sun dipping behind the western ridges, that Clara asked a question that had lingered since her arrival. "Ethan," she said softly, "why didn't you marry before me? Why wait?" Ethan rested his forearms on his knees, gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was always chasing someone else's trouble. Outlaws, disputes, keeping the law alive. Never wanted to drag someone into a life that couldn't promise safety. By the time I wrote to you, I realized the chasing didn't matter. What mattered was coming home to something worth keeping. Clara let the words settle. She reached out, lightly resting her hand near his on the wooden railing. Neither withdrew. Their fingers brushed, a fragile acknowledgement of mutual understanding, the first silent promise between them. The next week, the prairie stormed with fierce wind and heavy rains. Clara had just learned to manage the household alone when the tempest struck, the sky dark and unyielding. Roof shingles groaned, branches snapped, and the wind carried grit through every shuttered window. She latched the doors, secured the animals, and braced herself. When Ethan returned, soaked from rain, his bay gelding limped from a torn hoof. Clara rushed to help, lantern in hand. Together, they stabilized the animal, Ethan working with precision and patience, Clara following his guidance, steady despite her fear. That should hold, Ethan said finally, sweat and rain clinging to his shirt. He glanced at her. You did right. Couldn't have managed it alone. Her heart swelled, not with pride, but relief. She was more than a guest. She was part of this life, part of the land, part of the man beside her. That night, as the storm passed, they sat in quiet reflection, the fire crackling. Clara realized the work of the frontier was not just in survival, but in trust, in learning to rely on each other. Ethan's silence was no longer distance. It was a steady presence, a commitment forged in action, not words. Weeks passed, the rhythm of their shared life settling into something unspoken yet firm. The land required attention. The chores demanded diligence, and the town's gossip lingered at the edges of their consciousness. But inside their walls, Clara and Ethan built a life of quiet resilience. One evening, under a sky freckled with stars, Clara leaned against Ethan on the porch. She admitted softly, I was afraid I'd never belong here. He tightened his arm around her shoulders. Now you do, he said simply, eyes scanning the horizon. Not because of them, but because of us. The days stretched long, work steady and demanding. Clara's garden took root. Ethan repaired fences and mended tools, and together they transformed the small house into a home. She no longer felt the weight of outsiders' judgment. She had a place, a purpose, and the man beside her who had chosen to remain, choosing her every day without question. The following morning dawned crisp and bright. Clara rose early, the prairie light casting long golden streaks across the wooden floorboards. Ethan was already outside, tending the animals, his hands deftly checking the barn and smoothing the harness on the bay gelding. She watched him for a moment, noting the easy rhythm in his movements, the subtle patience that carried over from his law work into farm life. When she stepped outside, he glanced up and offered a nod, a small smile tugging at the corners of his sun-worn face. Morning, he said simply. No fanfare, just acknowledgement. Clara moved to the pump, testing her strength as she drew water for the animals and the house. Each movement felt deliberate, purposeful, as if she were learning not just how to survive, but how to belong. Ethan walked alongside her, not touching, not guiding, but always present, his quiet confidence offering a steady undercurrent against the unknown of her new life. After feeding the chickens and refilling the water trough, they sat on the porch, coffee in hand. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and wet earth from the previous night storm. Clara, feeling a weight she had long kept buried, finally asked the question she'd rehearsed for days. Ethan, when will you stop riding with the marshal? When will you stay? He looked out toward the open plains, eyes distant. Soon, he replied, slow and measured. I've been thinking about it a lot. The work, it's necessary, but so is the life waiting here. I want to be here, with you, not just in passing, not just at the house or the land. Fully. Clara's chest tightened. She had feared that his commitment to the law might always pull him away, that she might only ever have a partial husband, a man split between duty and home. But his words, though simple, carried weight. They were a promise made through intention, not ceremony. The day passed with chores and small triumphs. Mending a fence that had sagged under winter storms, organizing the barn, checking the trap lines near the creek. Each task built trust, not just in the land, but in each other. Clara found herself studying Ethan, not just a man who could handle a gun or a horse, but the man who could build, repair, and protect without arrogance. By late afternoon, A calm settled over prairie. The wind softened, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and the distant river. Ethan had finished his chores and leaned against the fence, observing Clara as she swept the porch. She met his gaze, hesitation in her eyes. "Do you ever regret asking me here? Bringing me into this life?" Ethan considered, his hands gripping the rail. "No," he said finally. "Not once. You're steady. You make this place more than wood and stone." "And I," his voice faltered slightly, a rare break in his measured tone. "I want to stay. I want us to stay." Her breath caught, the intensity of his words, stripped of pretense or flourish, carried a truth that made her pulse quicken. She set the broom aside, walking toward him slowly. "Then we're together in this." "Fully." Ethan met her step for step. "Fully," he confirmed, eyes unwavering. "No shadows, no half measures. What we build here, it's ours. And nothing, no outlaw, no storm, no town gossip, changes that." For a moment, they stood on the sun-warmed porch, the prairie stretching endlessly beyond. Clara reached for his hand, hesitating just enough to savor the significance. Ethan clasped her fingers gently, a silent acknowledgement, a promise without words. The evening fell, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. They moved inside, the house quiet except for the settling wind and the crackle of the fire Ethan had built. Sitting together at the table, Clara placed her hands over his, feeling the steadiness, the warmth, the commitment that had once been letters on paper and now stood flesh and bone before her. Later, as darkness deepened, they lit lanterns and moved to the bedroom. Ethan's hand brushed the small of her back, guiding her not with insistence but with care. Clara's heart raced, not with fear, but with the gravity of choice, trust, and the life she had crossed the continent to claim. The night stretched long. Ethan's presence was a steady anchor, the weight of his body and the certainty of his intent grounding her. Clara, once uncertain and fearful, now felt the fragile thread of belonging tighten into a rope strong enough to hold. At a pause, he whispered, low and deliberate, "We're alone now. Let's do what must be done." Clara understood, not just the intimacy the words implied, but the commitment, the joining of lives, the unspoken vow to face the world together. She nodded, voice barely a whisper. "Yes, together." The hours that followed were not hurried, not driven by passion alone, but by care, respect, and the acknowledgement of each other's past, losses, and hopes. It was a union of trust as much as desire, a quiet covenant built in the privacy of their shared walls. When dawn broke, the prairie bathed in soft gold, Clara and Ethan lay side by side, a new understanding weaving between them. The past, storms, whispers, and trials, had led them here. The future, uncertain and vast as the plains themselves, would now be faced together. By mid-morning, Ethan rose, dressing quietly. He looked down at Clara, who still lingered beneath the covers, and offered a small, reassuring smile. "We'll work the land, feed the animals, and face whatever comes. Together." Clara nodded, feeling the weight and freedom of his words. They were no longer two individuals navigating separate worlds. They were a unit, a partnership forged through distance, danger, and deliberate choice. The next days brought rhythm and routine. The chores continued. The land demanded attention. But there was now laughter, quiet conversation, and shared decisions. Clara learned to feel the soil in planting beans and herbs. Ethan taught her to ride along the perimeter safely. And each evening, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the horizon, drawing strength from each other's presence. And so, the prairie no longer seemed endless and daunting. The house no longer felt empty. The mail-order bride was no longer a stranger, and the cowboy had no longer a restless shadow of a life divided. Together, they had built a life worth the miles, the risk, and the patience it took to arrive at this moment of quiet certainty. The days settled into a rhythm neither had fully known before. Each morning, Clara rose early, the prairie light spilling gold across the floorboards as she moved with purpose. Ethan followed shortly after, tending the horses, checking the fences, and preparing for whatever work the day demanded. Their steps fell into harmony, not forced, but natural, a cadence built from shared effort and mutual respect. Clara's hands grew skilled with chores she had once feared: milking the cows, filling the water troughs, tending the chickens. Each small success bolstered her confidence, and Ethan noticed. He no longer hovered, but his eyes lingered, a quiet pride hidden behind the sun-weathered lines of his face. He had always known the prairie could harden a person, but he had not expected it to reveal such strength in her. Word of her arrival slowly reached the townsfolk. The whispers that had followed her softened with time. They saw Clara not as a mail-order bride, but as a woman who could manage a house, care for animals, and stand steady in the face of storms. Children waved as she passed the general store. Neighbors offered smiles, and even Mrs. Lee's sharp tongue was tempered when she noticed Clara handling the work with grace. One afternoon, as Ethan repaired a section of fence near the river, Clara joined him, carrying a bucket of water. She set it down and watched him for a moment, the river's soft gurgle filling the space between them. He didn't speak immediately, and she didn't feel the need to fill the silence. They worked side by side, hammer and nails moving in quiet tandem, the sweat and sun a testament to their shared labor. When the fence was secure, Ethan leaned back, wiping his brow. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. "So have you," she replied. There was no romantic flourish in her tone, only recognition of the endurance, patience, and choices that had brought them here. As evening approached, the prairie bathed in hues of amber and rose. They returned to the house. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them. Clara carried a small basket of herbs she had gathered, setting them on the table. Ethan poured coffee into their tin cups, the aroma rich and grounding. For a moment, they simply sat, the firelight dancing across the walls, the day's work behind them and the night ahead. "Ethan," Clara began softly, "I've been thinking about the letters and the life I thought I would have back east." She paused, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I never imagined it would look like this. And yet, I've never felt more alive." Ethan's eyes softened. "This isn't the life either of us expected," he admitted. "But it's real. It's ours. Every choice we make here shapes it. Every storm we survive, every fence we mend, every meal we share, it's ours together." Her gaze fell to her hands, callous from chores and steady work, then returned to him. "Then I choose this, Ethan. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. Because it's us." He reached out, taking her hand in his. The weight of his palm, strong yet gentle, conveyed more than words ever could. "And I choose you, Clara. Every day, every morning, every night. Here, now, and in all the days to come." A week later, the town gathered for a simple celebration. There was no grand parade, no pomp, only neighbors who had come to respect the steadiness of their union. The preacher spoke brief, earnest words, grounding the ceremony not in spectacle, but in acknowledgement of choice, courage, and shared life. Clara's dress, mended and pressed, shimmered softly in the afternoon sun. Ethan's coat, his only clean one, was worn but neat. When they exchanged vows, it was a quiet testament, a pledge forged from hardship, endurance, and mutual respect. Afterward, neighbors offered gifts: a basket of eggs, a pair of milk cows, a coil of rope, each one practical, each one a sign of inclusion. Clara accepted them with a smile, but it was the acceptance from Ethan, steady, unwavering, that mattered most. In the weeks that followed, life continued with rhythm and routine. Clara planted her first garden, straight rows of beans, onions, and herbs pushing through the soil. Ethan built a proper porch, board by board, so they could sit together and watch the sunset, without dust creeping in. Each small act, each labor shared, wove the house into a home that belonged to both. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara leaned against Ethan on the porch. The garden lay quiet, the fence line stretching toward the distant hills. "I feared I'd never belong here," she said softly. Ethan rested his arm across her shoulders, voice low and sure. "Now you do. Not because of the town, not because of me, but because of what we built together. This life, it's ours." The prairie stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time, it didn't feel daunting. It was filled with possibility. with the promise of steady work, shared mornings, quiet evenings, and the resilience born from surviving storms together. In the quiet of the night, with the stars vast and clear overhead, they lay side by side, the weight of the past lifted, the uncertainty of the future tempered by choice. The mail-order bride was no longer a stranger, and the cowboy was no longer a man divided. Together, they had forged a life grounded not in expectation, rumor, or fear, but in shared labor, mutual respect, and the steady pulse of belonging. The world beyond the prairie could still whisper, storms could still rage, and dangers could still arise. But inside the walls of their home, in the rhythm of daily life and the shared strength of hands and hearts, Clara and Ethan had found what they had sought, each other, steady and unshakable, ready to face all that the Wild West would throw at them. Together, and as the fire burned low, their shadows dancing across the wooden floor, neither spoke. None was needed. The life they had chosen, the union they had forged, was enough. The frontier, once vast and uncertain, now carried the certainty of their presence. A life claimed, a choice made, and a future shared, a quiet triumph in a land of harsh light and long nights.